Under the tired fluorescent lights of the Riverdine diner, the wall clock ticking, as if counting down the hours, Amy Harris bent down to wipe down table number 19 for the third time. The wood was so polished that it reflected her reflection, but her calloused hands still gripped the damp rag as if to erase the fear that was choking her chest. The night in Willow Creek was silent. Only the sizzling sound came from the kitchen, where Diego, the head chef of the evening shift, was scrubbing old pans. The smell of leftover frying oil mixed with cold coffee creates a familiar but heavy scent. Amy looked up and checked the clock, 10:45. Her body ached after 12 hours of standing, her heels burning red in her worn-out shoes. In her apron pocket, the white paper had been folded many times, like an old wound that had not healed. Amy pulled it out, the bold letters dancing before her eyes. Custody hearing, Mason Harris, July 20th, exactly 25 days, a time that felt both short and long. Mason, the 7-year-old with the gummy smile, was her whole world. But now he lived with Victor Santos, her wealthy and cold ex-husband, 50 miles away in Willow Creek. 3 months ago, with money and a team of lawyers, Victor had temporarily taken custody of Mason, claiming Amy was unable to care for him financially. The phone buzzed in her shirt pocket. The screen lit up with a picture of Mason smiling, holding a strawberry ice cream. Below the image, Victor's text message was like a cold knife. "He's no longer asking about you. Don't even think about beating me in court." Amy's chest hurt. She gripped the phone so tightly that her fingernails dug into her palms. She wanted to call back and scream that Mason was her son, that she would do anything to get him back. But Amy knew Victor would laugh, like when the court ruled in his favor. She stuffed the phone and the summons back into her pocket, trying to swallow the bitterness rising in her throat. Amy had grown accustomed to hiding the cracks in her heart as a single mother with a smile. But every night when she returned to their shabby apartment on the edge of town, the fear of losing Mason forever would roll up like a black wave. "Go home, Amy." Diego's voice echoed from the kitchen, half joking, half worried. "This place is cleaner than a hospital." Amy laughed dryly, shaking her head. "I have some work to do." Diego shrugged, hung up his apron, and headed out the back door, leaving her alone in the blinding white light. Amy sat on the bar stool, resting her elbows on the cool table. The old question returned. How am I going to win against Victor? No money for a lawyer. No hard evidence. Love for Mason. Something that courts rarely consider enough. A cold wind whistled through the crack in the door, making Amy shiver. She remembered the nights Mason had fallen asleep beside her, hugging his teddy bear, whispering, "Mommy, can we make apple pie tomorrow now?" Only the photos in the shoebox under the bed were evidence of those peaceful days. Mason at age 2, his face smeared with mashed potatoes. Mason at age 4, fast asleep on the sofa. Mason at age 5, in his uniform, on the first day of school. Outside, the small town was enveloped in darkness. No one knew that a mother was trying to balance despair and fragile hope in the corner of the empty cafe. She held her son's photo tightly in her mind, whispering a promise only she could hear. "I won't give up Mason, even if it costs me everything." Some journeys start with seemingly small moments. A text message, a look, or a stranger walking in, just as the door is about to close. And tonight, Amy doesn't know that the door is about to open to a story she could never have imagined. If you also believe that love and resilience can change fate, leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and follow the channel to join me on Amy's journey, where each chapter is filled with hope, pain, and surprises waiting ahead. The chime above the diner's front door broke the quiet like a drop of water in a still pond. Amy lifted her head, startled. It was nearly closing time. Customers at this hour were rare. A tall man stepped inside, brushing the dust from his leather boots. The overhead light caught the broad line of his shoulders beneath a blue plaid shirt, the brim of a weathered cowboy hat, shadowing the upper half of his face. When he removed it, a sweep of salt and pepper hair caught the glow, and pale eyes, cool, yet not unkind, searched the room. His gaze landed on her steady and unhurried. "Sorry," Amy said, automatically rising from the stool. "We're about to close." "Just coffee," he replied. His voice was low resonant, carrying the unhurried drawl of someone accustomed to open fields and long silences. "Been driving 6 hours from the next county. Need something to keep me awake." Amy hesitated. The clock on the wall inched toward 11. She wanted to go home, shut the door, and curl up with Mason's photographs. But something in the man's eyes, fatigue, laced with a quiet sincerity, made her nod. "All right," she said softly, stepping toward the coffee machine. "Take a seat. I'll make it fresh." He settled at the counter, placing his hat beside him. The light revealed the deep creases around his eyes, lines carved by years under the sun. Amy focused on the steady gurgle of brewing coffee, willing her hands not to shake, not from exhaustion, but from the odd sense of being quietly watched. When she set the steaming mug before him, he glanced down at her name tag. "Thank you, Amy," he said, as if tasting the syllables. The way he spoke her name carried a weight she wasn't used to, an acknowledgement, not just politeness. She nodded and turned away, resuming her endless ritual of wiping the spotless counter. Outside the parking lot lay empty under the silver cast of moonlight. The only sounds were the soft ticking of the clock and the man's slow measured breaths as he sipped. After a while, he reached for his wallet. "How much? $3.50. He pulled out a $20 bill and set it on the counter. "Keep the change." Amy frowned, pushing it back toward him. "You don't have to do that. I don't need charity." His mouth curved, not smugly, but with a gentleness that disarmed her. "It's not charity. Everyone needs a little help sometimes, right?" Before she could reply, he slid the bill closer to her, rose, and set his hat back on. "Good night, Amy." And just like that, he was gone, his tall figure receding into the stillness beyond the door. Amy stood where he'd left her eyes, falling to the $20 bill on the counter. It lay there like a small silent question. After a moment, she tucked it into her apron pocket, beside the folded court notice. Who was he? And why did a stranger's kindness feel so unsettling, as though it might unravel something she had spent years stitching tight she didn't know? But she faintly felt that this night had shifted something just a fraction inside her. The following night slid into the quiet hour, before closing the diner bathed once more in that pale fluorescent light. Amy moved with the steady rhythm of habit, refilling the sugar jars, stacking chipped coffee cups, and wiping down spotless tables. The silence was a balm until the front door chime rang again. She looked up, half expecting a lone trucker or a late-shift nurse. Instead, the tall man from the night before stepped inside. The same worn boots, the same plaid shirt, though the collar sat a little straighter this time, and the same calm, searching eyes met hers, as though no time had passed. "I think I left something here," he said, his voice carrying that easy, unhurried cadence. Amy blinked, then noticed the scuffed leather wallet sitting beside the register. She hadn't even realized it was his until now. Picking it up, she slid it across the counter. "Here you go." His hand brushed the wallet, the brief contact unexpectedly warm, the skin rough with calluses. "Thank you," he said, tucking it into his back pocket. Most customers would have turned and left, but he didn't. Instead, he pulled out the stool he'd used last night and sat down, not directly in front of her, but a seat or two away. He rested his hat on the counter, looking out the window toward the empty parking lot. "You work here alone this late?" He asked, his gaze still on the glass. "Just tonight," Amy replied, keeping her tone neutral. The cook left early. He nodded as though filing that away. "Name's Scott Garcia. Got a farm in Green Haven about 30 miles from here. Driving at night like this. Coffee's a lifesaver." Amy hesitated. In Willow Creek, strangers rarely offered this much of themselves. She wasn't used to men, especially men like him, volunteering their names so easily. "Amy," she said, tapping the name tag on her shirt, as if to keep the exchange simple. Scott smiled faintly. He said, "Better than most places I've stopped at," nodding toward the coffee pot. The compliment threw her off balance. She wasn't sure how to respond, so she busied herself at the counter. But she could feel his eyes drift toward her hands, small dark, marked with faint scars from hot plates and long hours. On her fourth finger, the thin silver ring from her grandmother caught the light. He said that working this late must be tiring, not as a judgment, but almost like an acknowledgement. "You have family nearby." Her heart stuttered. "Just me and my son," she said, finally her voice quieter than intended. "But he's not here right now." Scott didn't push. His gaze returned to the window, where the moonlight spilled over the silhouette of his pickup truck. "I used to have a daughter," he said after a pause. "Emma. She liked to draw just like I did as a kid. But I missed my chance to be there for her." His voice dipped lower, carrying a weight that felt almost tangible. "Sometimes I wish I could go back and do things differently." Amy found herself studying his profile. The lines carved deep around his mouth, the way his shoulders seemed to hold more than just the strain of work. She recognized a grief in his voice, though she couldn't name it. "I wish I could do things differently too," she said, before she could stop herself. The words slipped out like a secret, and she turned away quickly, pretending to wipe the counter again. Scott didn't answer right away. He finished his coffee, set the cup down gently, and reached for his wallet. This time he laid a $10 bill on the counter. "For the next cup, if I come back." Amy said, "You don't have to do that," pushing it back toward him. "I don't take tips like that." He smiled, slow and steady, not bothering to argue. "Consider it an investment in good coffee." Then he picked up his hat, gave her a nod, and walked out into the night. Amy watched him go, the $10 bill still on the counter. For a long moment, she didn't move. Then she folded it, once slipped it into her apron pocket, alongside the court letter, and let herself wonder briefly why a man like Scott Garcia looked at her as though he understood. The dawn broke pale and reluctant, the horizon painted with thin strokes of lavender and gray. Amy stood in the middle of her grandmother's small plot of land, on the outskirts of Willow Creek, the wooden handle of a hoe firm in her calloused hands. Her breath came in slow, deliberate pulls, matching the steady rhythm of turning soil. The damp scent of earth rose around her, grounding her in a way nothing else could. This land wasn't just a garden. It was proof, fragile but real, that she could provide for Mason. Every row of tomatoes and green beans was a statement to herself, the court, and perhaps most of all, to Victor. Her grandmother's voice seemed to echo faintly. "Land will never betray you if you care for it." Amy paused, brushing the back of her wrist across her forehead. Her arms ached from last night's shift, her feet still sore from hours on the diner floor. But she didn't stop. Each plant and seedling was part of her case, her chance to stand before a judge and say, "I can give my son a home." The wind picked up suddenly, sending a low rustle through the leaves. She glanced up toward the east. Dark clouds were rolling across the sky, thick and heavy, devouring the pale morning light. Her pulse quickened. "No, not today," she murmured, gripping the hoe tighter. A storm right now could flatten everything. The plants were still young, vulnerable. Without them, the little extra income she scraped from selling vegetables at the Saturday market would vanish along with one of the few pieces of tangible stability she could show in court. Thunder cracked in the distance, deep and resonant. The first cool drops splattered across her cheeks. She dropped the hoe and sprinted toward the small wooden shed, yanking out the stack of plastic tarps she kept folded inside. The wind fought her at every turn, tearing the slick sheets from her hands. Her hair whipped into her eyes as she tried to stretch a tarp over the first row of tomatoes. The plastic snapped like a sail in the wind, rain pelting down harder now. She dropped her knees in the mud, trying to hold it in place, her fingers numb and trembling. Amy. The voice was deep, cutting through the storm. She turned toward the fence and saw Scott Garcia standing there with his hat pulled low, his boots already caked in red mud. For a split second, she thought he was an apparition, conjured by the chaos of the rain. "Need help?" he called. She hesitated. How did he even know she was here? But there was no time to ask. She pointed to the tarp's flapping edge. "Grab that side." Scott vaulted the fence with surprising ease and was beside her in seconds. Together they wrestled the tarp over the plants, his hands moving with a practiced precision that spoke of years working the land. Rain soaked through both of them, plastering Amy's hair to her face, dripping from the brim of his hat. "Are there more?" he shouted over the roar of the storm. In the shed, she yelled back, and they scrambled through the mud to grab another 2 tarps. The ground had turned slick, and Amy's foot slid from under her. Before she could hit the earth, Scott's hand closed firmly around her arm, pulling her upright. "Careful," he said, his tone steady despite the chaos. They covered the remaining rows, tying the sheets down with old rope Scott had pulled from his truck. Lightning forked across the sky, but the plants now lay beneath a plastic shield, shivering but intact. Amy stood there panting, her clothes clinging cold to her skin. Scott tipped his hat back, swiping water from his brow. "That should do it," he said, surveying their work. Her breath came in shaky bursts, a mixture of exhaustion and disbelief. "Why are you here?" she finally asked. "I was passing by," he replied, as though it explained everything. "Saw you fighting the wind alone. I couldn't just keep driving." His eyes, pale and unyielding, flicked toward the rows of tomatoes. "This land means a lot to you." Amy swallowed the rain now, nothing but a mist clinging to her skin. "It's all I have," she admitted quietly. "If I lose it, I don't know how to prove I can raise my son." Scott's gaze held hers, unwavering. "You don't need to prove anything to me," he said. "Any mother who fights like that deserves to have her child by her side." The words struck somewhere deep inside her, somewhere she usually kept barricaded. She turned away quickly, afraid he might see the tears, mixing with the rain on her cheeks. The wind eased and the clouds began to break, letting a faint silver light seep across the field. Scott gestured toward the shed. "Go warm up. I have to get back to the farm. But if you need anything..." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small slip of paper. "Greenhaven's not far. Call me." Amy took it, her fingers cold against the warmth of his hand. She wanted to ask why a stranger would show up in a storm to help her, and why he looked at her as if he understood. But the words caught in her throat. Scott tipped his hat and stepped back over the fence. She watched him walk toward his truck, the headlights cutting a pale path through the wet morning. The paper in her hand felt heavier than it should have, like it carried a promise she wasn't ready to name. She slipped it into her pocket beside the folded court notice, then returned to the glistening rows under their makeshift shelters. For the first time in months, she felt something faint but steady inside her chest. It wasn't certain, but it was hope. The rain had thinned to a gentle patter tapping against the shed's tin roof in a slow, uneven rhythm. Amy sat on an overturned wooden crate, her soaked clothes clinging to her skin, her damp curls sticking stubbornly to her cheeks. The earthy scent of wet soil and crushed tomato leaves filled the air, mingling with the faint musk of old wood. Scott stood in the doorway, one boot resting against the frame, his drenched hat tilted back just enough for the dim morning light to find the deep creases around his eyes. He didn't speak at first. He seemed content to look out at the field, where their hastily tied tarps shimmered under the drizzle. "You all right?" His voice was low, but it carried easily in the quiet. Amy nodded, though her voice felt caught somewhere in her chest. "I'd have lost everything out there if it weren't for you." Scott's lips curved in a small restrained smile. "I only did what anyone would do." He glanced at her, then his gaze searching without pressing. "You're not just growing vegetables. This land means something more." Her eyes drifted toward the rows beyond the doorway, to the dark, wet soil her grandmother had once tended with those weathered, capable hands. "It belonged to my grandmother. She used to say, land would never betray you if you cared for it. When she passed, I promised I'd keep it going for Mason." She paused, her throat tightening at her son's name. "For my son. You mentioned him last night," Scott said, his tone gentler now. "Where is he?" The question brushed against a tender wound. Amy hesitated, unused to sharing her private battles, especially with someone like Scott, who seemed to belong entirely to another world. But something in his manner, an unspoken patience, made the words slip free. "He's with his father," she said finally. "Victor Santos, my ex-husband. He says I'm unfit to raise Mason and the court. They believed him. I have a hearing in a few weeks, but—" She shook her head, a bitter edge to her voice. "I don't know how I'm going to win." Scott remained still, the steady weight of his attention fixed on her. Then slowly he stepped further into the shed, setting his hat on the crate beside him. "I had a daughter once." He began, his voice carrying a heaviness that felt like rain pressing against glass. "Emma. She was 5 when I lost her. And her mother. A car accident. Back then, I thought I was building a future for my family, working every hour I could to make Green Haven something worth passing on. But I missed so many moments. When they were gone, I realized all the land in the world didn't mean a damn thing without the people you love to share it with." Amy's chest tightened. She hadn't expected this from him, the man who had walked into her diner 2 nights ago, all calm confidence and easy smiles. "I'm sorry," she murmured, and meant it. Scott shrugged lightly, but his eyes didn't lose their depth. "That's why I helped you today. Because I know what it's like to lose what matters most. And I don't want to see you lose him, Amy. Not if you're willing to fight for him." She looked down at her hands, mud still clinging beneath her nails, her palms red from gripping rope and tarp against the storm. "I want to fight. I just don't know if I'm strong enough." "You are," he said without hesitation. "Every plant you've grown, every shift you've worked, that's strength. Don't let anyone, not even him, make you doubt that." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It felt weighted, like the air between them held more than just the scent of rain. Just for a moment, Amy's guard wavered before she remembered how kindness in this town often came with expectations. She couldn't afford to owe anyone. "Why are you doing this, Scott?" she asked quietly. "You don't know me. Why do you care?" He met her gaze, steady as the horizon. "Because I used to think I could do it all alone. I was wrong. People need each other." He stepped back toward the doorway, picking up his hat again. "You don't have to trust me right away. But if you need help, you know where to find me." The morning light was breaking through, now pale streaks threading across the sky. Scott set his hat back on his head and stepped out into the soft drizzle, heading for his truck. Amy stayed where she was, listening to the sound of the engine fading down the road. The slip of paper with his number in her pocket felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried more than just ink and digits. She took it out, holding it between her fingers, and for the first time in months, the gnawing fear in her chest eased enough for another feeling to slip in. Something quieter. Something like hope. The afternoon sun spilled through the diner's front windows, casting long rectangles of light across the worn wooden floor. The lunch rush had thinned, but the air still carried the mingled scents of fried potatoes, grilled onions, and coffee brewed hours ago. Amy moved quickly between tables, balancing a tray with practiced ease, the ache in her shoulders hidden beneath a polite smile. She had barely caught her breath from the morning's chores in the field. Every time she wiped her hands on her apron, the faint smell of wet earth clung to her, a reminder of the storm and Scott Garcia's sudden appearance. She hadn't called him since. The slip of paper with his number stayed tucked inside the same pocket as the folded court notice, an unlikely pair of lifelines. The front door chimed and she called, "Take any open seat," without looking up. But the voice that answered froze her mid-step. Well, well. Still pouring coffee for truckers. Amy Victor Santos stood in the doorway, as if the diner were his stage, the afternoon light sharpening the edges of his tailored gray suit. His polished shoes looked absurd against the scuffed floorboards, and the faintest curl of a smirk played on his lips. Amy's pulse jumped, but she kept walking until she reached the counter, setting down her tray. "What do you want, Victor?" she asked evenly, though the steel in her voice trembled at the edges. He sat directly in front of her, leaning forward on his elbows. "I'm checking in. Mason likes his new stepmother. Called her Mom last week." His words were delivered lightly, but the satisfaction in his eyes was cold and deliberate. Amy's breath caught. She gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles blanching. "Mason is my son," she said, her voice low but firm. Victor shrugged as if dismissing an inconvenience. "Do you really stand a chance in court? No money, no lawyer. Just that greasy apron and a weed patch you call a garden. You've got nothing, Amy." Before she could respond, the door chimed again. The sound was unremarkable, but the shift in the air was immediate. Scott Garcia walked in his boots, carrying traces of red dust, his plaid shirt slightly rumpled, as though he'd come straight from the fields. He paused just inside, taking in the scene in a glance. Victor's posture, Amy's clenched jaw, the charged air between them. Scott said, "Coffee." His tone calm, but deliberate, as he sat 2 stools down from Victor. Victor turned to look at him, eyes narrowing. "And who are you?" "New friend, Amy, or just another drifter passing through?" Amy ignored the bait, pouring coffee into Scott's mug. Her hands trembled just enough for him to notice. He reached for the cup without breaking eye contact with Victor. The smirk returned to Victor's face. "We're not done here," he said to Amy, and before she could step back, his hand shot out, gripping her wrist. Scott's voice cut through the air like a clean blade. "Let her go." The words weren't shouted, but they carried a weight that made Victor's grip loosen. Amy stepped back, rubbing her wrist where his fingers had dug in. "This isn't your business, cowboy," Victor said, straightening his tie with exaggerated precision. Scott leaned back slightly, but his gaze was unflinching. "I make it my business to know when someone doesn't know the meaning of respect." For a moment, no one moved. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator behind the counter. Then Victor stood, his expression cooling into something almost amused. "Can you fight me, Amy? I've got money, lawyers, everything I need. Mason doesn't need you anymore." He turned, walking toward the door. The chime rang again as he stepped out, his cologne lingering like an unwelcome shadow. Amy's breath left her in an unsteady rush. She retreated to the kitchen, the swinging door closing behind her. Diego was at the grill, flipping toast, his brow furrowing as he caught sight of her pale face. "You okay?" he asked, wiping his hands on a towel. She shook her head, her voice breaking. "He's going to take Mason, Diego. He's right. I've got nothing to fight him with." A shadow moved in the doorway. Scott was there, leaning against the frame, his expression unreadable but intent. "You can fight," he said, each word deliberate. "I know someone, Daniel Carter, the best lawyer in the state. He owes me a favor." Amy blinked, startled. "Why would you?" Scott said. "You don't owe me anything," stepping into the kitchen. He pulled a cream-colored business card from his shirt pocket and placed it in her hand. "Call him tomorrow morning. Tell him I sent you. You don't have to do this alone, Amy." The card was smooth and weighty between her fingers, embossed with black lettering that seemed almost too sharp in the fluorescent light. She looked up at Scott, torn between suspicion and something she didn't want to name. Diego glanced between them, then nodded toward Amy. "Listen to him, girl. Mason needs you." Scott didn't wait for her answer. He set a few bills on the counter for the coffee, then turned toward the door. He said, "I'll be at Greenhaven if you need me," and left without looking back. Amy stared at the card for a long moment, her thumb tracing the letters of Daniel Carter's name. She thought of Mason's smile, Victor's voice dripping with quiet venom, the storm in the field, and the man who had stood beside her in it. Maybe she had nothing, but maybe that was about to change. The following morning was cold enough to paint a thin film of frost over the edges of the diner's front windows. Amy stood outside the downtown Willow Creek office of Daniel Carter, clutching her worn handbag against her ribs. The dark blue dress she'd chosen, the one she'd bought from a thrift store 2 years ago, felt suddenly too thin for the early wind. Her fingers tightened around the business card Scott had given her. The embossed letters caught the pale sunlight, Daniel Carter, attorney at law. It didn't just feel like a card. It felt like a key she wasn't sure she was allowed to turn. She stepped inside. The waiting room was modest, but meticulously kept, cream walls, lined with law books, a faint scent of lemon polish in the air. A young receptionist greeted her with a polite smile and offered a glass of water. "Ms. Harris, Mr. Carter, we'll see you now." Amy smoothed her dress and followed her into a small but well-organized office. Behind the desk sat a man in his early 50s, round glasses perched low on his nose, sharp eyes softened only slightly by his warm smile. "Please have a seat," he said, standing to shake her hand. "Scott Garcia called me this morning. He told me you're fighting for custody of your son." "Why don't you start from the beginning?" May's voice caught on the first words, but she pushed forward. She told him everything, how Victor had used his wealth to sway the court, how he had painted her as financially unstable, how every text from him was sharpened to cut her down. She slid her phone across the desk, showing Carter the most recent message. "Give up. You'll never win." Carter's brows knit as he read it. These are useful. Threatening language can be persuasive to a judge. Amy hesitated, then pulled an envelope from her bag. Inside was an old photograph, faded, but still clear enough to show the faint bruises on her arm from a night 3 years ago when Victor's temper had gone too far. Her throat tightened as Carter examined it in silence. "If authenticated, this could be robust evidence," he said, placing the photo gently back on the desk. "But we'll need more. Proof of your steady income, your living environment, and if possible, anything that shows inappropriate behavior on Victor's part." Amy reached into her bag again, producing pay stubs from the diner, handwritten receipts from selling vegetables at the market, and a few photographs of her small plot of land, green and thriving. "It's not much," she said, almost apologetically, "but it's enough for Mason. My apartment is small but clean, and there's a good school nearby." Carter's expression softened. "Scott said you're a hard worker." "I believe him. But the court won't just look at heart, they'll look at stability. Victor is a formidable opponent, but those messages you've saved tell a different story. That's where we start." She exhaled slowly, the first thread of relief in days winding its way through her chest. "I don't have the money to hire a lawyer," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Carter leaned back in his chair, his smile small but certain. "You don't need to pay me, Ms. Harris. I owe Scott a favor from 10 years ago, and I take debts seriously. But I will need your cooperation. Gather every piece of evidence you can, no matter how small, and don't let Victor push you into mistakes." Her eyes stung, but she nodded. "I'll do whatever you need. Bring my son home." Before Carter could respond, the office door opened. The receptionist stepped in, looking faintly startled. "Ms. Harris, there's someone here to see you. The boy with him says you're his mother." Amy's heart slammed against her ribs. She was on her feet before she could think. Mason rushed in, his brown eyes, shining curls, in disarray from the wind. "Mom!" he shouted, flinging himself into her arms. She dropped to her knees, holding him so tightly she could feel his heartbeat against her own. The scent of his shampoo and the warmth of his small hands, clutching at her dress, were all she had dreamed of for 3 endless months. "I missed you so much," she whispered into his hair. "I missed you too," he said quickly, breathless with excitement. "My teacher let me bring this." He pulled a crumpled drawing from his backpack, the two holding hands beneath a bright yellow sun, the words "Mom and me forever" scrawled above in uneven letters. Amy's throat closed, but she smiled, smoothing his hair. "It's beautiful, baby." Carter was smiling too, though his gaze had shifted toward the doorway. Heavy footsteps approached, the sound sharp against the carpet. Victor appeared, his expression hard and cold. "Mason, let's go." Mason shrank against Amy. "I want to stay with Mom." Amy rose her arms around her son, her voice steady but edged. "What is he doing here?" Victor pointed at her, his words clipped. "This is a violation of custody. I could sue this office." Carter stepped forward, his tone calm but firm. "Mr. Santos, this is private property. Mason's teacher brought him here at his own request. If you have a problem, I suggest you take it with the school. In the meantime, you should leave." Victor's glare shifted between Amy and Carter, his jaw tight. "Do you think you're clever in dragging in a lawyer? This won't save you." Before Amy could answer, another voice joined the room. Scott stood in the doorway, his presence quiet but resolute. "Is there a problem?" Victor's lips curled. "You again. This isn't your business." Scott's eyes didn't waver. "When it involves her, it is." For a moment, thick and immovable tension swelled between the three men. Then Victor's hand closed around Mason's arm. Mason resisted, his voice trembling but clear. "I want to be with Mom." Amy bent and kissed her son's forehead. "Just a little longer, baby. I promise it's going to be okay." Reluctantly, Mason let go. Victor led him out without looking back, the door shutting with a heavy finality that left the room too quiet. Amy sank back into her chair, clutching the drawing in both hands, her fingers brushing over the golden sun. Carter's voice was gentler now. "That boy loves you. That's the most substantial evidence we have. But we need to prepare." She looked at Scott, then the moment's weight pressing between them. "Thank you," she said, her voice rough with emotion. Scott's expression was calm, but his eyes held something steadier. just making sure you're not alone in this fight." Amy folded Mason's drawing and slipped it into her bag. She felt something that almost resembled strength for the first time in weeks. The battle wasn't over, far from it. But now, she wasn't walking into it alone. The late morning sun lay warm over Willow Creek, softening the edges of the town's weathered buildings. Amy stepped out of the diner, just as a dusty green pickup pulled into the curb. Scott Garcia leaned out the driver's side window, his arm resting easily against the frame. "Got a few minutes?" He asked, his tone casual, but his eyes fixed on her with a quiet insistence. Her shift didn't start for another half hour. Still, she hesitated. "Depends on why." "You'll see," he said. Something in his voice, steady, certain, slipped past her usual caution. She told Diego to cover the opening shift and climbed into the passenger seat. The truck smelled faintly of hay and leather, the scent that lingered on clothes and in memory. The road to Green Haven stretched wide and winding, lined with trees just beginning to show the first hint of summer fullness. Amy sat with her hands folded in her lap, the engine's hum a low, steady backdrop. When they crested the final hill, the view opened into a sweep of golden pasture and orderly rows of crops. A leading house, white-trimmed and solid, stood beyond a weathered wooden barn with expansive glass windows. Horses moved lazily in the distance, their tails flicking in the sunlight. "This is your home," she said quietly, unable to keep the note of awe from her voice. "My home and my work," Scott replied, pulling up in front of the barn. "Started with 5 acres. Took a lot of years and a lot of mistakes to turn it into this." He led her into the barn. Instead of the scent of livestock, there was the clean aroma of fresh wood and a faint trace of apples. The space was open light, filtering in through high windows. He said, "I've got a proposal for you," stopping in the middle of the empty floor. Amy raised an eyebrow. "A proposal I heard from Diego about your grandmother's apple pie recipe," Scott continued. "You've got something special there. I want you to open a bakery here. This barn," he gestured to the vast sunlit space, "could be perfect for it." She stared at him, uncertain whether to laugh or step back. "A bakery, Scott? I can't even cover rent this month. I don't have the money, the equipment, any of it." He said, "I'll handle the startup money, materials, renovations. You bring the recipes, the work, and your name. This isn't charity, Amy. It's a partnership." Her gaze drifted to the tall windows, where sunlight fell in angled stripes across the floor. The idea was dangerous in how much it tempted her. Mason running between the tables, the scent of apples and cinnamon in the air. Her place. But danger came in other forms too. Victor's voice echoed in her head, mocking and certain. "You've got nothing." If he learned about this, he'd twist it into something to use against her in court. "I don't know, Scott," she said finally. "Things are complicated right now. Victor won't leave me alone. If he thinks this is some way for me to get ahead, he'll find a way to poison it." Scott studied her for a long moment, then gave a slight nod. "You don't have to decide now. Just think about it. Mason deserves to see his mother doing something she loves." Before she could answer, her phone buzzed in her pocket. Pulling it out, she saw Carter's name on the screen. The message was brief. "Preliminary hearing, set for 9 a.m. tomorrow. Be at my office at 8 to prepare." Her knees felt suddenly unsteady, the weight of the words sinking into her bones. "Tomorrow," she whispered almost to herself. Scott stepped closer, his voice low. "Then tonight, you don't think about Victor. You focus on what you want for Mason. The court will see it, Amy. You've got more to fight with than you think." Her eyes burned, though she refused to let the tears fall. "I have nothing," she murmured. "There is no money or enough proof. How do I fight him with that? You have your son. Scott said, his tone unwavering. You have that drawing he made for you. You have the truth. And if you'll let me, you have me. She looked up at him, startled by the weight in his voice. He didn't look away. When I lost Emma, he went on, I thought I'd never find meaning again. Helping you. Helping Mason. It's the first thing that's made sense in a long time. Amy's breath caught. She wanted to believe him, but the part of her that had learned the hard way to expect a price for every kindness held her back. I don't want to owe you, she said quietly. Scott said with faint sadness in his smile, all I want is to see you and Mason happy. No strings. He reached for his keys. Come on, let's get you back before Diego starts thinking I kidnapped you. She gave a small laugh, the first one that had come easily all day, and followed him outside. As the truck rolled back toward Willow Creek, she looked out at the fields of Green Haven, and for the briefest moment, allowed herself to picture a bakery tucked inside that sunlit barn, Mason's laughter spilling out the open doors. But when they reached the diner, the reality of tomorrow's hearing pressed back in. She stepped out of the truck, clutching Mason's drawing in her bag like a talisman. Thank you, she said, her voice low. Scott met her gaze steady and sure. You're not alone, Amy. Call me if you need anything. She nodded, then watched him drive away, the green truck disappearing into the bend of the road. Tomorrow would decide more than just custody. It might determine the shape of the rest of her life. The morning of the hearing broke with a brittle stillness, as if even the air knew it would have to hold its breath. Amy stood before the small bathroom mirror in her apartment, hands pressed to the edge of the sink. Her dark hair was pulled back into a neat twist, the same thrift store navy dress she'd worn to meet Daniel Carter, smoothed down as best as she could manage. On the counter lay Mason's drawing, creased from being folded and unfolded too many times. She'd brought it with her tucked inside a folder of documents Carter had requested. Not as evidence, at least, not officially, but as a reminder of why she was walking into that courtroom. By the time she reached Carter's office, he was already waiting. Ty nodded with meticulous precision, a stack of files under his arm. You ready? He asked. No, she said honestly. That's fine, he replied, offering a reassuring smile. I'm ready enough for both of us. The courthouse in Willow Creek was a squat red brick building that smelled faintly of old paper and lemon polish. Inside, the polished floors clicked beneath her heels as she followed Carter down a narrow hallway. Her palms felt damp despite the cool air conditioning. When they stepped into the courtroom, Victor was already there. His suit was immaculate, his tie a deep, authoritative red. At his side sat a younger woman, his new wife, in a sleek gray dress. Her arm draped over the back of Victor's chair, her expression calm, almost dismissive. Victor's lawyer, a sharp-faced man with silver hair, shuffled papers with confidence from years of winning. He didn't even glance at Amy. Carter pulled out a chair for her. Remember, he murmured, you don't have to speak unless addressed directly by the judge. Let me handle the rest. The judge, a middle-aged woman with a steady gaze, entered the room. Everyone rose. Amy kept her eyes on the polished wood of the table before her, breathing slowly to keep her pulse from racing. Victor's attorney spoke first, painting a picture of a struggling single mother with unstable income and limited resources to provide a safe and consistent home. Amy's jaw tightened at every phrase, but Carter's hand on her forearm kept her still. When it was Carter's turn, his voice was calm but unyielding. He laid out Amy's work history, steady employment at the diner, and efforts to supplement her income by cultivating and selling produce. He submitted the pay stubs, the photographs of her garden, even the market receipts, small things, but strung together into something steady that might stand. Then he slid a printout across to the judge, one of Victor's recent messages. You'll never win. Mason doesn't need you. Carter let the words sit in the air, momentarily, heavy and deliberate. Victor shifted in his seat. Your Honor, Carter said my client may not have the wealth of Mr. Santos, but she has the stability, the dedication, and most importantly, the bond with her son that every child deserves. We are prepared to present witness testimony to that effect. The judge nodded, glancing down at her notes. We'll hear the witnesses tomorrow, she said. I've heard enough today that this matter requires a full custody hearing. It wasn't a victory, not yet, but it wasn't a defeat either. Amy felt the tightness in her chest ease, just slightly. As the session adjourned, Victor leaned toward her across the aisle, his voice low enough that only she could hear. You think you've won something today? You haven't. This is just the beginning. She didn't answer. Instead, she reached into her folder, touching the edge of Mason's drawing, letting its bright crayon colors steady her. Carter walked her out of the courtroom, the midday sun spilling across the courthouse steps. You did well, he said. Tomorrow we bring in people who know you and can speak to the life you've built for Mason. If Scott's willing, his testimony could help. Amy hesitated. Scott's already done enough. I don't want to drag him deeper into this. Carter gave her a pointed look. If he's offering, you'd be wise to accept. Judges pay attention to character witnesses who stand in the community. And Scott Garcia, well, he has standing. They parted at the curb, and Amy started toward home. Her mind still tangled in the tension of the courtroom. But halfway down Main Street, she saw the green pickup outside the diner. Scott was leaning against the driver's side, a to-go cup in his hand, as if he'd been waiting. How'd it go? He asked when she approached. We didn't lose, she said. That's something. His gaze softened. Then it's a step forward. She hesitated, then added, Carter thinks you should testify. About me. About what you've seen. Scott nodded as if he'd already made up his mind. I'll be there. Amy swallowed, her voice quiet. Why? He didn't look away, because some fights are worth showing up for, even if not your own. The wind picked up slightly, carrying the faint scent of coffee and cut grass. She stood there longer than she meant to, the courthouse weight still pressing on her, but softened now by something almost like steadiness. Tomorrow would be harder. Victor would fight dirtier. But for the first time, Amy knew she wouldn't be standing alone at that table. The evening after the hearing settled over Willow Creek like a low, restless tide. The streets were quiet, the last sunlight spilling thin and gold over the rooftops. Amy walked home with Mason's drawing in her bag and the echo of the courtroom still in her ears. Every word Victor's lawyer had spoken clung to her like damp clothes. Unstable income, limited resources, unfit mother. Words sharpened to wound. Her apartment felt smaller than usual when she stepped inside. The pale walls, the second-hand couch, the thin curtains seemed to shrink beneath the shadow of tomorrow. She set her bag on the table and pulled out Mason's drawing, smoothing the creases with the palm of her hand. The drawing was simple, 2 figures holding hands under a yellow sun, but the details caught her the way Mason had drawn her, with a broad smile, the way their hands were bigger than anything else on the page, as if he knew that connection mattered more than the background. She left it on the table where she could see it from the kitchen. She boiled water for tea, letting the steam fog the edges of the small window. Carter's instructions repeated in her mind: gather every witness you can, show the judge the life you've built, and show the people who will stand for you. She already knew she could ask Diego, maybe a couple of her regulars at the diner. But Scott was different. When the phone rang, she almost didn't answer. But the caller ID made her stomach twist. It was him. Thought you might need dinner. Scott's voice came warm and even. I'm outside. She hesitated, glancing at her reflection in the darkened window. Then she opened the door. He was standing there in a faded denim jacket, holding a paper bag that smelled of roasted chicken and fresh bread. "You didn't have to." "I know," he interrupted gently, "but you've got enough on your mind without worrying about cooking." Inside, he set the bag on the table, gazing at Mason's drawing. He didn't touch it, but his eyes lingered on it, making her throat tighten. They ate quietly at first, the refrigerator's hum filling the space between words. After a while, Scott leaned back in his chair. "Tomorrow's going to be rough. Victor's lawyer will do everything to make you doubt yourself. But I've seen you in a storm, Amy. I know how you fight." Her gaze flicked up to his. "What if it's not enough? It will be." He said, his tone steady, as if willing it into truth. "And you won't be in there alone. I'll tell the judge what I've seen. The way you work, the way you care for that land, the way you talk about Mason. It's not just words. It's proof." The admission stirred something she didn't want to name. "Why are you doing this, Scott?" He didn't look away. "Because I've been on the other side. I know what it's like to leave a courtroom with empty hands. If I can help you avoid that, I will." They finished dinner, and when he left, the apartment felt quieter. But the quiet wasn't empty. It held a different weight now, the kind that comes when you know someone else is willing to carry part of your burden. She didn't sleep much that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the judge's steady gaze, Victor's smirk, and Carter's calm determination. But she also saw Scott standing beside her, in that barn filled with sunlight, offering something she still couldn't believe was real. Before dawn, she dressed in the same navy dress, her hair pulled back again. She pinned Mason's drawing inside her folder, not for evidence, but as an anchor. When she stepped outside, the morning air was cool, edged with the faint scent of dew. Scott's green pickup was parked at the curb, engine running. "You didn't have to get me," she said, as she climbed in. "I know," he replied, eyes on the road ahead. "But some days you shouldn't have to walk in alone." The courthouse loomed ahead, its red brick catching the first light of the day. Inside, the hallways were hushed, the walls lined with framed photographs of long-past judges. Carter was already waiting, papers neatly arranged, his expression focused. "We've got 3 witnesses," he said, glancing between them. "Diego, Mrs. Thompson from the market, and Scott. That's enough to show the court who you are outside Victor's shadow." Amy's pulse quickened. The idea of Scott speaking in that room, putting himself into the heart of her fight, was both terrifying and grounding. Victor was already there as they stepped into the courtroom, his lawyer murmuring something that made him smirk. Amy sat brushing the folder's edge, where Mason's drawing waited. Tomorrow had come, and though its weight pressed heavily on her shoulders, she felt a thread of something steadier winding through it, something that might hold. The second day in court began with the smell of polished wood and the low murmur of voices echoing off the walls. Amy sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands folded tightly in her lap, the folder with Mason's drawing resting just within reach. Carter leaned in, speaking quietly. "Today's about showing the judge the truth of who you are. The facts matter, but so does how people see you as a mother. Trust your witnesses." She nodded, though her stomach felt like a fist. Across the aisle, Victor sat, with perfect posture, his new wife whispering something in his ear. His smirk had returned, that same cold, knowing curl that had haunted her for months. The judge entered, and the room stilled. After the formalities, Carter called the first witness, Diego. The diner's kitchen manager walked to the stand with the same brisk stride he used when balancing 3 orders simultaneously. He spoke plainly, but with conviction, describing Amy's work ethic, how she always took the shifts no one wanted, how she sometimes left early, only if Mason needed her. She's the kind of person who'll work a double shift, then go home and bake pies for the market, all because she wants to keep a roof over her son's head, Diego said, his voice carrying a quiet admiration. Victor's lawyer tried to poke holes, asking whether Amy struggled to pay her bills and whether the diner work was truly stable. Diego didn't flinch. Stable isn't about how big your paycheck is. It's about showing up every day. And Amy always does. Next came Mrs. Thompson from the Saturday market. She was trim and gray-haired, her hands gnarled from decades of tending her garden. She spoke of Amy's stand the way Mason sometimes sat beside her reading, while Amy sold produce, how customers returned, not just for the vegetables, but for the warmth of her welcome. She treats people right, Mrs. Thompson said, and she treats that boy like he's the best thing in the world. Victor's lawyer pressed her, suggesting that selling vegetables at a market wasn't a serious livelihood. Mrs. Thompson's eyes narrowed. She said that raising a child is the most serious work there is, and the judge's expression softened ever so slightly. Then it was Scott's turn. Amy's pulse quickened as he rose from his seat, the measured sound of his boots against the floor filling the room. He wore a charcoal jacket with the quiet ease of his usual flannel and denim. When he took the stand, his voice was calm, steady. "I've known Amy Harris for only a short time," he began. "But in that time, I've seen her face two storms, the kind that tear through a field and the kind that tear through a life. In both, she's stood her ground." He told the judge about the morning of the storm, how he'd seen her fight to save her grandmother's crops, alone, refusing to abandon what she'd built. He spoke of her dedication to Mason. Her eyes lit when she talked about him, and she carried his drawing everywhere. Victor's lawyer leaned forward. "Mr. Garcia, are you in a romantic relationship with Ms. Harris?" Scott met the man's gaze evenly. "No. But my opinion of her doesn't depend on that. This isn't about me, it's about what's best for her son. And I believe no. I know that's being with her." The lawyer pressed again. "You're a wealthy man, aren't you, or Garcia? Isn't it possible you're offering her help to gain influence over her?" Scott's jaw tightened, but his tone remained even. "Influence? No. Respect. Yes. I'm offering help because I believe in doing right when you can, and Amy Harris is the kind of mother any child would be lucky to have." Amy's throat ached at his words. She kept her eyes on the folder in front of her, afraid that if she met his gaze, the emotion in her own would be too obvious. When Scott stepped down, Carter gave her a slight nod, as if to say, "That was the turn we needed." Victor's lawyer called one final witness, Victor himself. He painted himself as the stable provider, with resources and a secure family environment. He spoke of his new wife's role, their larger home, and their private school plans for Mason. But under Carter's cross-examination, cracks showed. Carter produced messages where Victor belittled Amy, notes about missed visitation dates, and even an old police report from a night of domestic disturbance 3 years prior. Victor's voice grew tighter, his posture more rigid, the charm slipping like a mask coming loose. When the judge called a recess, Amy could breathe again, just a little. She stepped into the hallway, the air cooler than inside. Scott was there, leaning against the wall, hands in his pockets. "You did well," he said. "I didn't do anything," she replied. He said, "You didn't have to," his gaze steady on hers. "You just had to be who you are." They saw it. For a moment they stood in silence, the sounds of the courthouse muffled around them. Amy realized then that no matter what tomorrow's ruling brought, she would remember this quiet certainty in someone else's voice when her own had been so uncertain for so long. and as they stepped back toward the courtroom, she carried that steadiness with her, tucked right beside Mason's drawing. The courthouse felt different after the testimonies, quieter, heavier, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. The judge had recessed until the following morning to review the evidence and prepare a ruling. That left Amy suspended in a space that was neither victory nor defeat, a day she had to survive without knowing how her life would turn out. Outside, the late afternoon light was warm, but thin, the kind that hinted at the slow approach of evening. Carter walked with her down the courthouse steps, their footsteps echoing in the near-empty street. "You did well in there," he said, his voice even. The judge paid attention. "That's more than I can say for some cases." Amy nodded, clutching her folder to her chest. "What happens now? We wait." Carter replied, "Don't let Victor get under your skin between now and tomorrow. That's precisely what he wants." They parted at the corner, Carter heading for his office while Amy headed home. She didn't expect to see the green pickup idling near the curb outside the diner, but there it was. Scott leaning against the door, a coffee cup in his hand. "Thought you could use a ride," he said when she approached. "I live 3 blocks away," she replied, though she found herself smiling despite the weight in her chest. "Then it's not about the ride," he said. "Get in. I want to show you something." She hesitated only a moment before sliding into the passenger seat. They drove out of town, the road unfurling in long, quiet stretches. The sun dipped lower, casting the fields in amber light. When they reached Green Haven, Scott didn't head for the barn or the main house. Instead, he steered toward the property's western edge, where the land sloped down toward a small grove of apple trees. The branches were starting to swell with green fruit, and the air carried the faint, sharp scent of leaves. Scott stopped the truck and got out, motioning for her to follow. "This was the first thing I planted here," he said, resting a hand against the trunk of the nearest tree. "Didn't know a damn thing about orchards back then. Lost half of them to frost that first winter." Amy ran her fingers along the rough bark. "Why'd you keep going?" He shrugged. "Because the ones that survived were worth it. Took years before they gave fruit. Now they're the best part of the farm." She glanced at him, catching the unspoken message. "You're saying I should just keep standing even if I lose tomorrow?" "I'm saying," Scott replied, "that some things take time to prove their worth. Doesn't mean they're not worth the fight." For a while, they stood in the orchard, the only sound the faint rustle of leaves in the evening breeze. Amy found herself breathing easier here, the tight coil in her chest, loosening just enough to let air in. When they drove back toward town, the horizon was brushed with the last streaks of orange and pink. Scott pulled outside her apartment building, but didn't turn off the engine. "Tomorrow," he said, "whatever happens, you walk in there, knowing you told the truth. That's more than most people can say." She met his gaze, something warm and unsteady flickering beneath her ribs. "And if the truth isn't enough, then we find another way," he said without hesitation. Inside her apartment, the silence felt less oppressive than it had earlier. She placed Mason's drawing on the table again, propping it against a jar so it stood upright. She made tea, sat by the window, and watched the streetlights bloom one by one. She tried to imagine the judge in her chambers reading through Carter's notes, weighing Diego's plain-spoken loyalty, Mrs. Thompson's market stories, Scott's steady testimony. She tried not to picture Victor's smirk, the way his lawyer's questions had bitten at the edges of her life. When night finally came, it came softly without fanfare. Amy left the light on in the kitchen, letting it spill across the drawing, the crayon sun glowing faintly in the yellow bulb's warmth. She lay in bed and listened to the quiet, her thoughts drifting like slow-moving clouds. Tomorrow would bring an answer. Not the end of the fight, but the next chapter. and as she drifted toward sleep, the scent of apple leaves and the memory of Scott's voice, low, steady, specific, lingered like something she could almost hold. The morning broke clear and bright, with a pale blue sky stretched wide over Willow Creek. Amy woke before her alarm, her body tense, as though it had been bracing for this day even in sleep. She dressed carefully, navy dress again, hair drawn back neatly, and slipped Mason's drawing into her folder, the edges now softened from her constant handling. The walk to the courthouse felt shorter than it had on the other days, though her steps were slower. Each block carried the weight of what was about to happen. Scott was waiting outside, leaning against the green pickup, his jacket unbuttoned, the faint lines around his eyes deepening in the morning light. "You ready?" he asked. "No," she said truthfully. He gave a small smile. "Good. Only liars are ready for days like this." Inside the courtroom hummed with the low murmur of voices. Carter was already at the table, his papers neatly aligned. He gave her a nod as she sat, his expression calm but focused. Across the aisle, Victor looked as polished as ever, his new wife beside him in a pale silk blouse. His lawyer whispered something to him, and he smirked without glancing over. The judge entered, and the room stilled. Amy's heart began to pound in time with the sound of the gavel. "I have reviewed the testimony, the evidence, and the conduct of both parties," the judge began. Her voice was measured neutral, but every word seemed to settle on Amy's shoulders, like a stone. "This case is not without complexity. The court recognizes Mr. Santos's financial stability and resources. However," that single word shifted the air in the room. Amy's breath caught. "However," the judge continued, "the stability of a child's life is not measured solely in material wealth. It is measured in consistency, emotional security, and a parent's demonstrated capacity to meet the child's needs." Victor's posture stiffened, though he kept his face neutral. "The court has found Ms. Harris to be a dedicated, attentive, and reliable caregiver. Despite limited financial means, multiple witnesses' testimonies confirm her commitment to her son's well-being. Furthermore, certain behaviors displayed by Mr. Santos, both in communication and in prior incidents, raise concerns about his ability to foster a healthy co-parenting environment." Amy's chest tightened. She could feel Scott's steady gaze from the bench behind her, like a weight anchoring her in place. "The judge's ruling is that Mason Harris's primary custody be awarded to his mother, Ms. Amy Harris, with reasonable visitation rights extended to Mr. Santos." The gavel came down, once crisp and final. For a moment, Amy couldn't move. Her hands clutched the table's edge, the words settling into her like sunlight after weeks of rain. Carter's hand rested lightly on her shoulder. "You did it," he said softly. Across the aisle, Victor's lawyer leaned toward him, babbling. Victor's jaw was tight, his smirk gone, replaced by something colder, more brittle. He glanced at Amy only once before turning away. Outside the courthouse, the air felt sharper, brighter. Amy stood on the steps, folder pressed to her chest, as if keeping the ruling inside it safe. Scott joined her hands in his pockets. So he said, "How does it feel to win?" She let out a breath that felt like it had been trapped for months. "It feels like I can breathe again." They stood there long enough, letting the morning settle around them. Cars passed and people hurried along the sidewalks, but none seemed to touch the quiet space between them. "Come on," Scott said finally. "Let's get you home. I imagine someone's waiting for you." He was right. Mason was sitting cross-legged on the couch with a book in his lap at the apartment. The moment she opened the door, he was on his feet, rushing into her arms. "Do I get to come home now?" he asked, his voice muffled against her shoulder. "Yes," she whispered, holding him tighter. "You're home." They spent the rest of the morning in the small kitchen, Mason chattering about school, while Amy made pancakes. Scott stayed only long enough to drink a cup of coffee, but when he left, there was a quiet understanding in his eyes, something unspoken but steady. Later, when Mason fell asleep on the couch, Amy stood by the window looking at the street. She thought of the orchard at Green Haven, the barn bathed in sunlight, and the possibility that had felt too dangerous to consider. With the ruling in her hands and Mason's breathing steady in the next room, she let herself imagine it. Not just survival, but something more. Something that might grow if she were willing to plant it. And for the first time in a long while, the future didn't look like a battlefield. It looked like open ground. Spring in Willow Creek had a way of arriving all at once, as though the earth had been holding its breath through the last frost, and then suddenly decided to exhale. The days grew longer, the air softer. Green Haven began to hum with life calves in the pasture bees, drifting lazily between rows of budding flowers. The apple orchard cloaked in white blossoms that swayed in the wind like scattered lace. Amy stood beneath one of those trees, the hem of her dress brushing against the grass. Mason darted between the trunks, his laughter carried on the breeze. His cheeks were pink from running his hair wild and sunlit. It was the kind of sound Amy had once been afraid she might never hear this freely again. Scott approached from the barn, sleeves rolled to his elbows, a faint smudge of dust along his jaw. He carried 2 paper cups of lemonade, handing one to her without a word. For a while they watched Mason chase a wayward butterfly. "You're quiet," Scott said finally. Amy smiled faintly, her eyes still on her son. "I'm just trying to take it in. For so long I've been bracing for the next fight. It's strange not to feel that weight, pressing down every second." He said that weight doesn't just disappear overnight, leaning against the tree beside her, but it gets lighter, especially when you let something else take place. She turned to look at him, sunlight slipping between the blossoms and painting his face in dappled gold. "And what exactly am I supposed to let take its place?" His mouth curved, not into a teasing grin, but something softer. Hope, plans, maybe even a little joy if you can stand it. The words caught her off guard, not because they were unexpected, but because of the steadiness with which he said them, as though joy was something tangible she could pick up and carry home. They walked through the orchard, Scott pointing out the younger trees he'd planted over the last 2 years. "They won't bear much fruit this year," he explained, "but next year they'll start to show what they're made of." Amy traced her fingers over the smooth bark of a sapling. "You have a lot of patience for things that take their time." Scott's eyes softened. "The best things always do." Later they returned to the barn, which smelled faintly of fresh paint and sawdust. A set of plans lay on the workbench, sketches of expansive windows, open shelves, and a corner space for a small counter. "You've been busy," she said, flipping through the pages. "I told you," Scott replied. "This place is perfect for a bakery. You said you weren't ready before. I'd make sure it's ready for you when you are." Amy looked up from the plans, something warm and unsteady rising in her chest. "Can I do this?" "I know you can," he said. "You've already done more complicated things." Mason's voice called for her outside, and she stepped toward the open barn doors. He was holding a branch he'd found on the ground, its tip crowned with a cluster of blossoms. "For you, Mama," he said, placing it in her hands. Amy smiled, the petals trembling in the light breeze. She glanced back at Scott, who was watching quietly from the shadowed edge of the barn. In his gaze, she saw no urgency, no pressure, only the quiet belief of someone who knew that roots needed time before they could bear the weight of fruit. They spent the rest of the afternoon there, the hours slipping past unnoticed. When the sun began to lower, casting the orchard in amber light, Amy realized She wasn't thinking about court dates or bank balances. She was thinking about paint colors, the smell of cinnamon in the air, and Mason's laughter, mixing with the rustle of leaves. And though she didn't say it aloud, she knew that something in her had shifted. The fight was behind her. Ahead lay something she'd almost forgotten how to imagine days built, not around surviving, but around building. It was, she thought, the first real bloom of her own season. Summer came slowly that year, unfurling in long, warm days that seemed to linger over Willow Creek. By July, the orchard was thick with green leaves and the promise of fruit, the air sweet with the scent of wildflowers curling along the fence line. Amy stood in the barn, now fully transformed. The windows Scott had added let in generous sunlight pooling over the smooth wooden counters. Jars of flour and sugar waited beside mixing bowls on the shelves, each holding the quiet thrill of possibility. Mason was at a small table near the window drawing as always. This time the picture wasn't just of the two of them. It was of three figures hand in hand, standing in front of rows of apple trees. The crayon sun above them was bigger than any she'd seen him draw. Scott walked in carrying a basket from the orchard, the apples still warm from the sun. "First harvest," he said, setting them on the counter. "Not much, but enough for a pie or two." Amy smiled, brushing her fingers over the smooth skin of one apple. "We start small. That's how everything worth keeping starts," Scott said. His gaze held hers for a moment longer than usual, steady and quiet, like the pause between heartbeats. The first pie came out of the oven that afternoon, its golden crust filling the barn, with a scent that pulled Mason from his drawing and had Scott leaning against the counter with an approving nod. They ate it while the light shifted toward evening, the world outside slowing to match the pace inside. When Mason had gone to wash his hands, Amy stood beside Scott at the doorway, watching the orchard in the soft dusk. The fireflies had begun to appear, blinking like distant lanterns between the trees. "You know," she said quietly, "for a long time, I thought my life would always be about holding on, about fighting, not to lose what little I had. I never thought about what it would be like to actually build something." Scott's voice was just above a whisper. "You've been building all along, Amy. The court just gave you the space to see it." She turned to face him, the last light catching in his eyes. "And you gave me something else. You gave me room to believe in more." There was no grand gesture, no sudden rush. Just the slow closing of distance, the quiet certainty of two people who had weathered enough storms to know the value of stillness. His hand found hers, rough and warm, and she let it stay there. The summer days continued, marked not by court dates or fear, but by the rhythm of orchard work pies cooling on the counter and Mason's laughter spilling into the open air. Amy knew there would still be hard days. Life didn't turn into a fairy tale overnight. But the difference now was that she had a place to stand, roots deep enough to hold, and people who would stand with her. And somewhere between the rows of apple trees, she had learned that love didn't always come like lightning. Sometimes it arrived like a season you didn't realize had already begun until you stepped outside one morning and found the world in bloom. If you've followed Amy and Scott's journey from the beginning, you know this isn't just a story about winning in court. It's about finding your place, your people, and the courage to plant something new after the storms have passed. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to like, comment, and follow so you don't miss the next one. Share your thoughts. What part of Amy's journey spoke to you the most? Your words might be the encouragement someone else needs to hear today.